It's Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's Tuesday, January 17th, 2023. You're welcome to join the program at 617-396-4958. That number again, 617-396-4958. I want to thank the good people over at TECN, the Exceptional Conservative Network, for carrying my program starting last week. Ken McClanton, a shout out to you, the owner. Thank you very much. My guest this segment is Dr. Michael Rechtenwald. Dr. Rechtenwald is the author of the new book, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda. He's a professor at various universities, including NYU and Hillsdale College. Michael, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
It's good to be here, Charles. Thanks for having me.
Michael, let's just get into some basic definitions. The World Economic Forum, headed up by Klaus Schwab out of Geneva. He authored a book that actually was published just at the very beginning of the pandemic called The Great Reset and COVID-19. So how long has this group been around, and what was going on with the publication of that book?
Well, they've been around since 1971 and were founded as the European Management Forum that year. In that same year, Schwab wrote his first book in German, and it's not been translated. It's about mechanical engineering and management in mechanical engineering. But in that book, he introduced the concept that's since gone viral. It's become the main, it's the main object of the World Economic Forum, and that is stakeholder capitalism. So they're an international. In 1987, they changed their name to the World Economic Forum, and they call themselves the International NGO for Public-Private Cooperation.
And it's also attended by both world leaders and heads of corporations, international corporations like Bill Gates, and world leaders like American presidents, apparently including Donald Trump, where they get together for this annual powwow in Davos and discuss probably economy more than anything, and it sort of seems to want to work hand in glove with the United Nations and with some level of indirect enforcement in the world. Now, what was the basic content then of Klaus Schwab's book as it came out? I mean, was he attempting to somehow capitalize on the pandemic? Because it does seem to be awfully coincidental, and coincidences often don't just happen out of nowhere. That the book came out right at the beginning and right around the time that governments around the world, some didn't, began to call for lockdowns. One government that was an exception, interestingly, was Sweden. Anyway, so what is the connection there?
Well, you're right. Going back just a bit, you were right. The World Economic Forum has a partnership with the UN. They signed this in 2019. They are partners with the UN. Anyway, the COVID-19, the Great Reset, published in June 2020, just after a month after the annual meeting that launched the Great Reset, really called for a change in the world economic system because of COVID-19. They suggested that it had revealed the weaknesses of the capitalist neoliberal system, as they call it, and likewise that there needed to be immediate changes to the system. But they had been calling for a global reset of the economy all the way back to 2014, if not earlier. So, there are papers that they published 2017 about pushing the global reset button on the world economic system. So they seized upon the COVID crisis as a pretext, if you will, to enact what they had been advocating for years. And I should say that the lockdowns really weren't their idea as such, but as it turns out, they had a great deal to do with it because there's research, and I've documented this in the book, where their young global leaders were in power. The most draconian lockdown measures were enacted. So their young global leaders had a great deal to do with the response to the COVID crisis. And these draconian lockdown measures, in fact, were promoted by the WEF, and they still are, for future pandemics. In fact, in the May annual meeting in 2022, Schwab said, we have to be resilient for a new virus or other crises that we have on the global agenda.
Yeah, very threatening. And what do you mean on the global agenda? But you say young global leaders. I've heard that Justin Trudeau was one of those, and probably several others. Are these people that were trained by the World Economic Forum, perhaps in a manner that's analogous to the Rhodes Scholarship in England? I mean, how did it work?
Absolutely. That's the model. In fact, the Rhodes Scholarship is the model for the WEF entirely. They stem from these earlier roundtable groups that came out of the Rhodes Society.
Right, like Milner's Kindergarten. I mean,
that's right, the kindergarten group.
They talk about that. I mean, Professor Carol Quigley talked about that in Tragedy and Hope.
And I cite him pretty much in the book. I cite him prodigiously in the book. He documented the origin of these roundtable groups, and they include the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Club of Rome. Then comes the World Economic Forum, and then the Trilateral Commission. That's the lineage of this roundtable ancestry, and the WEF is one of these roundtable groups.
Okay, so then the WEF emanates out of the Rhodes Scholarship and the Cecil Rhodes programs, which were established at the turn of the last century.
That's right.
He was into this idea of informal world order run by what he called an Anglo-American establishment. They spawned different secretive organizations around the world. The big ones, as you say, was the Royal Institute in London and the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And they are not really all that loyal to or supportive of the concept of democratic republics and sovereign states, right, and all of the institutions that make freedom in states, such as private ownership and property and faith and family and other institutions that I would argue are natural to human society and that are supported by moral states. So we have then the World Economic Forum being the latest permutation of this ongoing, and I do use the word conspiracy because it is secretive. Yes. And, it does operate clandestinely and deceptively without really showing its hand. Now, I could get the fact that they got big time behind the pandemic and the lockdowns. You make the point that the countries that had the most draconian lockdowns are the ones who had people who had taken this kind of training. Countries that didn't, like Sweden, apparently, which people generally assume to be a liberal country, and it is, they did practically nothing during the lockdown. And yet their rates of hospitalization were not all that different than the countries that did the big lockdowns. Same thing in the United States. The states that had the big lockdowns, their rates were not that different than states that did practically nothing. And I include in that California, which didn't go along with the lockdowns. So, it brings up questions about the truthfulness of how the virus was handled. The virus was a real thing. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
But it does seem, and I think evidence is now coming out, that it was exaggerated and that hospitals were rewarded financially by reporting a patient who was tested positive for COVID-19 when that in many cases had nothing to do with why they were in the hospital. And that's so, and people who died if they tested for COVID-19, that would be listed as a COVID death when in fact it wasn't. It was maybe natural causes or cancer or something else. So I think it's, the book is, the information pretty much has come out now that these factors were greatly exaggerated. Do you talk at all, Michael, about the advent of what I think is the final nail in the coffin of freedom, and that is the development of an electronic passport to prove that you've taken the experimental jab?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's part of the there's a section, a whole part of the book on the fourth industrial revolution. And part of that, one of the technologies under that rubric is the digital identity. And digital identity would include such things as vaccine status and other, basically everything from cradle to grave. If they have their way, it would be a database that tracks a person entirely and reports all of this data to the central database. And this is digital identity, which could, of course, include a vaccine passport status, if you will, and also kind of a social credit score, a political profile. And this would be necessary, according to the Bank of International Settlements, for instituting a CBDC, or central bank digital currencies. That they would be basically, the CBDC would be connected to the digital identity. And this, of course, means that your transactions now not only are known and, completely transparent to the Fed in the case of the United States and the federal government, but also all saving, spending, and debt is known and potentially controlled. And we saw some evidence of that kind of control with the COVID distribution of money. And they're looking at that as a model for distributing money immediately to the parties that supposedly need it in response to crises. So this becomes like a kind of centralized database about all of your financial transactions. And it could lead to people being profiled using the digital identity and banned from the marketplace as sellers, as buyers, as what have you. So all of this is potentially unfolding.
A couple of years ago, before the pandemic, I listened to an interview with American scholar George Gilder, who had spent a lot of time in communist China, and who noted that in China they're implementing this score that they can keep track of the comings and goings and the political leanings of every person living in that country.
Right.
And I remember, and he was warning us that this was coming here, and that Google had already caved into it because they want to do business in China. I think that it's safe to say that it is here, and I believe that not individuals, but businesses and corporations are now getting scores regarding the social justice, which is just another word for socialism, and how far left they are, economic justice, and which has its own loaded meaning, and environmental justice, which is what they're doing in the environment. And if they don't score high enough, they get penalized in ways that I don't know if we can see. And I think that this showed its head recently when the baseball All-Star game was Coca-Cola decided not to sponsor it in Atlanta, their hometown, because the state of Georgia wanted to implement some basic electoral reforms and voter reforms.
Right.
They were afraid that they might get a ding on their their credit score. Is that right?
Yes, this is really the what the woke capitalism really it's the epitome of woke capitalism, and the sort of the end game of woke capitalism. It's using this environmental, social, and governance index, the ESG, to essentially direct capital at the compliant corporations and to starve other corporations and companies out of business by refusing to fund them. So this is massive. This is a massive regime, the ESG regime. It's been adopted by all of the top asset managers in the world, led by, of course, BlackRock Inc., with Larry Fink at the helm. And
Mhm.
Larry Fink has made it no secret that his investment portfolios, the way they invest money, that is, where they put their stock buyers are in the ESG scoring companies, ESG abiding companies, and they basically make no bones about a tectonic shift, as he put it, toward ESG funding. And that means that the non-compliant are starved of capital investments. That's why I say this stakeholder capitalism regime is really a cartel scheme. It's a woke cartel scheme. It's a monopoly scheme, a shared monopoly scheme. It's a way of creating monopolies or shared monopolies at the top and destroying other competitors in the process.
Indeed, you might even use the word collusion.
Yes.
But certainly it's something that would violate antitrust laws that go back to the late 19th century, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that it's not necessarily guys sitting around in some smoke-filled room somewhere, but it's an informal functioning of businesses operating under this informal regime, and that it is starting to stretch toward the individual. We can cite some people who we may not support them, people like, I don't know, Alex Jones, the people that are not politically correct, who all of a sudden are having their bank accounts shut down.
Right.
PayPal is shutting down bank accounts. I think I can say that. So, you may not like someone's political opinions, but this is still something that we cannot have, because if you have your bank account shut down and you have an electronic card, and the only reason why I think right now we don't have those is because of the Canadian truckers. They stopped it. Thank God for the Canadian truckers.
Yeah.
If they almost brought the world's economy to a halt. And it was over this issue. They were like, we don't want to be forced to have this experimental jab, and we don't want to have to show these cards in order to conduct our business. They shut down all of the roads in Canada, bringing the country close to its knees economically, because truckers, that's the basic of how everything functions. And it was spreading quickly. It was Australia, New Zealand, France, even Israel. They started to come out. So they backed away. They backed down on the electronic cards, which are senseless, because the vaccine does nothing to stop the spread anyway. From a public policy standpoint, if someone wants to get it, that's their business, and they want to give it to their children, that's their business. But it doesn't do anything to stop the spread of the virus, which was the justification from a public policy standpoint for these mandates.
But, it's interesting you mentioned Canada, because Chrystia Freeland, who was she's the Minister of Finance, or Deputy Prime Minister when the COVID crisis hit, but she was the Deputy of Finance. I think, something around that title is fairly close. She's the one who shut down the truckers' bank accounts and seized their property. And she is a WEF member, a World Economic Forum young global leader, trained up by the World Economic Forum. And she laughed when she was asked about the seizing of these bank accounts. So, this is just how far the tentacles of the WEF reach.
Indeed. And they use the usual propaganda smear with their Mockingbird media lackeys, saying that they were Nazis, when in fact, the vast majority of Canadian truckers are men of color and people of color. So it's just, it was a big lie, and this is what they do to anybody that doesn't genuflect to their point of view. So now we have a situation where, even though they backed away from, and you've just implied this earlier, they backed away from these draconian laws. Here in Boston, the new mayor, Michelle Wu, where I am, the first thing she did getting in office was sign a decree saying that everyone entering any business or restaurant or store in the city of Boston would have to show a card proving that they had been vaccinated. It was completely ignored.
Wow.
And then after the truckers, she had to back down and rescind it quietly. But the point I'm making is that even though they've rescinded these things, they're still there. They're not going to back away from this kind of power. In fact, President Biden just extended the COVID emergency legislation by another 90 days, even though COVID really is no longer an emergency. And I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. in his speech at the Capitol said that they're not going to ever relinquish these kinds of political powers. They have to be taken back somehow by people. I'm not sure how to do that, but
yeah, there's these are going to remain in their arsenal, these types of measures and these technologies to implement them. But it'll what they might try to do is float them more surreptitiously and incrementally. I think that effectively Trudeau really was precipitous in the introduction of these cards. And I think that the way the thing happened, unrolled with the trucker revolt, really was rolled back by the powers that be. They said, you've stepped over the line. We didn't want these measures so quickly. We needed to implement these more incrementally. Incrementalism is their modus operandus. They really do mean to do this, but they mean to do it slowly. And partnership through public-private partnerships. That means they're going to try to do it in conjunction with corporations. For example, you mentioned the social credit score in China. That is partly state-run and partly privately run. It's called the Sesame Credit Score System. It's run on the private side by the Alibaba Group, and it's run on the state side by the Chinese by the
Communist Party.
Yeah, well, by the People's Republic of China.
Yeah,
and so they do keep records on all these people, and they do enforce this social credit score. If you have a low score, you can't rent a hotel room, rent a car, go on high-speed rail, leave the country, even travel by air, etc. So, or rent a hotel, and they basically have it completely. They have these people hemmed in, and they're going to try to institute these things very incrementally, using corporations as the leading edge here. And that's really what, when you hear Klaus Schwab say public-private partnerships, this is what he's talking about. These are the kind of measures they're, and the ESG is of course a public-private partnership, because it's first being used, it's first being implemented vis-a-vis these corporations who are doing an end around the government and legislation in order to enact world significant change. And then they hope to follow it up with legislation like the edicts coming out of the Biden administration, the 12 plus executive orders to mitigate climate change, which were really an attack on fossil fuels, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes $367 billion directed at attacking the fossil fuel industry. So indeed, this is, but they have had some failures, and you're right. I think it's been admitted by the Biden regime that shutting down the Keystone Pipeline was a big mistake, and that the energy independence that they're touting, or I should say the renewables that they're touting, are nowhere near ready to replace the fossil fuel industry by 2050. That's absurd and would be utterly disastrous.
And also there are new problems emerging now with electric cars and with other, I think that electric buses, which were tried in California, were catching on fire. And there's, the technology, I think it's supportable if it's functional, but it's nowhere near there. And you can't just simply remove fossil fuels and expect there to be a void filled in our industrial society where we hope to continue to grow. Now, if you think that also there's not the possibility of collusion in the United States between government and media figures and private sector as they have in China, you might want to check out Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. And regardless of what you think of Musk, he is doing a great job over there of releasing information that indicates that Twitter had a backdoor to state governments and federal government and the Biden administration and secretaries of state like Katie Hobbs in Arizona.
Right.
where basically once a week they would meet with them, and the Secretary of States would say, we want you to remove this person and that person. We don't like this opinion and that opinion. There's a lawsuit right now here in Massachusetts that's dealing with this, with Dr. Shiva, who ran for the U.S. Senate. And he says that the Secretary of State here, William Galvin, was talking to Twitter. That was, everyone scoffed when he brought that up a couple of years ago, but now it's proving to be true. And it's not just Twitter. Twitter's probably the smaller player. Yeah. It's all of them.
It's not, and I maintain it's not just the federal government and their agents and agencies, but also I think these NGOs like the World Economic Forum, and in fact these international governance bodies like the UN also have backdoors into these social media platforms, and Google.
Right.
Let's not forget about them, because they're the ones that are shaping the entire infosphere. And effectively shaping reality, because they disappear things and totally bury, other views and narratives, and make it seem like they don't exist. Even news that doesn't exist that's happened. So they're shaping reality, and I think that this whole big digital conglomeration is what I call them, big digital. I think that, in fact, they have been in partnership with the state and what I'll call basically the global regime for some time.
Indeed. And I think that it's accelerated with the advent of more technology and a greater dependence on technology. And it's not so much censorship outright, but it's censorship by omission, by removing things. I mean, the reason I was banned from YouTube is I made some mild statements about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And I did it not as a medical expert, but simply reading reports that had been written by the government itself, right, and that indicated that these drugs were safe and that they could be used to reduce COVID. And yet I was censored for that. It tells me that the government is that's outright political censorship, but it's worse because we're talking about medicine here that can save lives. And that's really evil. I mean, the fact that, there could have been some basic remedies on the market that might have ended COVID a lot quicker or reduced it.
Absolutely.
That were suppressed. So then we have the monopolistic big pharma come in with these experimental jabs. I don't know if we even want to talk about that, but there's now indication that people are dropping dead around the world, and we're only talking about the high profile people. We're not even talking about people who are not well known, who maybe are dying in their sleep, including children and young people. And I think that they can't really hide this any longer. I think that my understanding is that the Biden administration, and probably at the direction of the WEC and all of those kindergarten roundtablers, they're trying to spin it as saying that it's because of global warming.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, I didn't realize that the global warmed in the past 12 months, all of a sudden.
Right. They're trying to make everything a function of global warming, from heart attacks to obesity in children to violence, terrorism, international warfare like the Russian-Ukraine conflict. All of this is now being ascribed to to climate change or global warming.
Oh, yeah. No, every time there's any kind of weird weather, I mean, they come right out, global warming. They don't know that. I mean,
they don't know at all. As a matter of fact,
yeah,
I take on the climate science, so-called, directly in the book. And frankly, it's very shoddy at best.
Right.
It's very shoddy at best. And I would go so far to say it's very close to outright fraud. So
a lot of it is computer projection and statistics. It's not actual observation.
Empirical observation.
Yeah. I mean, these people haven't left their computers and gone outside and taken a look at this in the real sense. So my guest is Michael Rechtenwald, and the book is The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda. Michael, you're an author of many, many interesting books, and I'm amazed that you're out there still as a professor at some of these institutions.
Well, I left NYU in 2019,
Okay.
basically canceled by them, and recently was able to. I was offered out of the blue, really, a distinguished fellowship at Hillsdale College, where they welcome open inquiry and free speech.
It's one of the few colleges left that actually does have that. And just as a sort of an illustration of what's happening in our college culture, comedians no longer go to colleges.
Right.
They can't.
They don't want anything to do with it. It's the most dangerous. It's the most dangerous platform you can imagine, and they're censored or ridiculed or destroyed by the audiences who have been programmed to respond to anything that is not following the leftist agenda. They've been utterly programmed to shout these idiotic, robotic phrases over and over again, and to deplatform anybody that speaks anything but leftist dogma. I mean, that's what I complained about this at NYU, and it's one of the reasons they ran me out of there, just because I pointed this out. And and the top administrators were behind getting rid of me. It wasn't students, it was faculty and the top administration.
Michael, you have observed up close this phenomena, and I know of situations like this in my own family, quite honestly, of people of a certain age. What the heck is going on here? Are people being, it's almost like they've got a computer chip implanted in the back of their head.
Yeah, it is.
What do you think that there is some kind of, look, I think that maybe I'm putting a little bit of a tin hat on here, but it's not a secret that governments have experimented in mind control experiments. The United States with MK Ultra, which came out during the Church Committee hearings. Great Britain has the Tavistock Institute. The Soviet Union was into this in a big way. I think they learned a lot from the way the Nazis did it with their, mass rallies and their, emotion, rallying, marshaling propaganda, which had and their use of media was brilliant. Is there something, have they really advanced to the point where they can engage in mass manipulation of people's minds, particularly young people?
I think so. I think what we're witnessing is a massive PSYOP campaign undertaken by what I call subversive elites who have penetrated all of the heads, all the agencies of government and all the major institutions of academia and all other cultural institutions, and have undertaken this kind of a PSYOP. Don't ask me what the mechanisms are. I'm not sure what the mechanisms are or how they have achieved this, but I can't see it as anything but a massive PSYOP campaign.
I think it's probably, again, I have no idea, but I think it's probably like the Manhattan Project,
right?
Which was the development of the nuclear bomb, where you had people in one area working on one thing, and then you had this other group in Montana doing something else, and the University of Chicago, there was a group, and MIT, there was a group, and nobody knew what the other group was doing, and they just knew what they were doing, and there were only a couple of people who actually knew what was going on. It has look to it, I think.
That's what I think too. I think they have these minions out there that are effectively programmed to, reiterate and enact and enforce this regime. But I don't think they know where it's coming from. And I think that the left, what I would call the left, they're effectively useful idiots or otherwise really bots, in effect, that behave as predictably as any bot driven by algorithms. There's nothing about their behavior that is anything but algorithmic. Yes to this, no to that, and anything that they're programmed to scream at and denounce, they do so. And they have these plug and play phrases that have been imported into their brains or downloaded into their brains that they repeat ad nauseum. They have no powers. They're not thinking by any standards of the,
right.
By any definition of the word thinking. This is not thinking at all. And this is what's overtaken our universities. I've said this in several books. Springtime for Snowflakes and Beyond Woke, they have indoctrinated these people to such an extent that they're utterly anti-intellectual, utterly anti-thought, and completely programmed to reiterate these phrases and to react to speech and other behaviors that they deem, wrong in a very programmatic way.
I mean, I think that anyone who knows anyone that has been affected by this knows what you're talking about. I certainly do. There's these undigestible phrases that trigger something in someone, and that it's not rational. I mean, the hate, I mean, not to bring up a subject, but the hatred of Donald Trump was not rational.
Yeah. No.
You can criticize Trump in a lot of ways, and I certainly do, but especially when it comes to the vaccine.
Yes, the Operation Warp Speed, indeed.
Yeah, which I think that they got him. I mean, this actually, I think that Deborah Birx kind of let the cat out of the bag on how they got Trump into it and got him on board with the lockdowns by appealing to the weak side of his personality, which is his overinflated ego.
Right.
You can do this. You can end the vaccine. You can create a vaccine, and you'll get all the credit. And then, of course, it's like Lucy in Peanuts. They pulled the football away just as the company had the vaccine. They refused to release it until after the election.
Exactly.
But he's, the idea is that people don't have a rational basis. I saw people go crazy over this without really being able to explain what was going on with them. I don't know if it's a long-term. You talk about the slow march or between to the institutions and
right,
and all of that. It's very Fabian in nature that people basically have been reconditioned.
Yes,
in ways.
Mass psychosis formation. Yeah,
yes,
as Desmond calls it, is the mass formation, and it's kind of like a psychosis because it is divorced from rational thought, and it's frightening to see the legions of these people. These minions and their behavior. I mean, they're programmed agents of the state, really, and the fierce defenders of the regime. Little do they know they're actually enforcing a regime that has been dictated by elites. They claim to be leftist, but they're actually supporting the establishment to the nth degree, and it's a really ironic situation.
It is. I mean, I always thought the left was in favor of free speech, and now you hear them coming out and attacking and denouncing Musk for freeing Twitter. But there were several things that I think exposed telltale signs of this kind of, I don't want to use the word brainwashing, but certainly people not acting in their best interest. And the two that I would cite would be parents bringing their children in for the vaccine. I think there's enough known about the vaccine at this point, and that its children are not getting COVID anyways. And yet they're doing it and they're smiling and they look like it's a political statement. And the second is children and pre-adolescents getting hysterectomies and castrations, and these you have to take drugs for their entire life so that they can pretend that they're changing their sex. And parents are on board with this. They're
totally on board.
It's like bizarre because obviously this is their children.
Right. And this is really, they're sacrificing their children on the altar of this narrative, of this whole, it's more than one narrative of this, interwoven agenda, which I think is, I think it's partly part of a depopulation campaign. I mean, it's not the whole of it, but it's certainly part of it, this transgender movement. What else are we to think about this when you're destroying people's reproductive capabilities or otherwise confusing them to the extent that they don't know what a man and woman is anymore? And likewise, they become so gender dysphoric that they're promoting gender dysphoria, and then they come along with the solution. So it's, problem, solution, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's very Hegelian.
And to my way of thinking, and call me old-fashioned, but I think that this is worse than Mengele. At least the Nazis, when they were doing experiments on children, they didn't pretend that they were doing something good for the children. They didn't care. Right. In this case, we have, this is going to make you happy. This is going to make you really who you actually are.
It's
And
astounding.
it is. And I'm not going to name names, of course, but I know a couple of people who are doing this, and they seem like very moral, upright people. I don't think they're even conscious of what they're doing. I mean, it's really gets down to, so, as you say, some kind of a mass psychosis. All right, Michael Rechtenwald's my guest. The book is available at all the major bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda. So getting back to the World Economic Forum,
Yeah.
they have sought to exploit the COVID-19 pandemic in such a way that would advance their agenda, as we talked about, the electronic passports, the crackdowns on small business, the loss of freedom, possibly a population control element to it, which is something that I think we need to study further. It could emerge. What else are they into? I mean, what is their economic vision for the world in maybe about 20 years from now?
Well, I think the stakeholder capitalism really is modeled after China. And Schwab has said, nothing but laudatory things about China's economy and the society that they produced. And his mentor, Maurice Strong, was also a great admirer of the Chinese communist system, and he lived in China to the end of his life. And so China, I call the system they want to implement capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And that is, they want these favored corporate partners at the top in collusion with the state, and kind of an actually existing socialism for the masses on the ground. So that's why they say things like, you'll own nothing and be happy.
Okay.
And they talk about a circular economy where you'll rent everything. And these things will just circulate throughout the population. You own nothing, including your car, maybe even your clothes. So yeah, all of these things, this model is really China. And I've called it by several names. It's corporate socialism, in the sense that Anthony C. Sutton gave that term, that is monopolies on top. And so socialism is a monopoly scheme. This is a monopoly scheme. And it's a socialist monopoly scheme. And people will say, well, how can you say it's socialist when there's these mega capitalist corporations involved? Well, socialism is a monopoly scheme. This is a monopoly scheme. It's just a different set of players controlling the monopoly. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was the state. In this case, it's kind of a state that's comprised of the government and these corporate bodies. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly
it's kind of it's an informal state. It's what Eisenhower, I think, accurately called the military-industrial complex. It's what Steve Bannon calls the administrative state. It's what Donald Trump calls the deep state. It's what Professor Michael Glennon at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy calls the double government. We have basically unelected, unaccountable bureaucracies basically transferring and assuming the powers of governance, while they leave in place what Glennon calls the Madisonians, the president and the Congress and the Supreme Court, and the Trumanites, he calls them, being the intelligence apparatus, which now has its own funding off the books, and which is huge. I mean, it's permeated all aspects of our society, and it's a legal secret society.
But moreover, they're also enrolling these corporations into the state. Informal state. These corporations are what I call governmentalities. They are essentially appendages of the state. They're state apparatuses doing state functions, enforcing and increasing the power of the state by virtue of their incredible technological power.
Indeed. So their vision is a socialistic vision where we'll basically move forward and we won't own anything. We'll eat bugs, and we will, and we will basically, and we'll be, there will be no more sovereign nation states other than as window dressing, where we'll go out and watch a football game and wave the flag on the 4th of July. But the actual governing power will reside with this informal and unelected international behemoth.
That's correct.
And then, of course, their future is transhumanism and artificial intelligence, which they intend to control in a very centralized way.
Absolutely. In fact, Yuval Harari, who's an advisor to Klaus Schwab, has lauded this, but in two things. They want to make themselves into superhumans or gods, as he puts it, while putting the population, whom he calls the useless eaters, under constant and total surveillance vis-a-vis these technologies, and even abrogating and eliminating their free will through algorithms. This is really what he says.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to be sort of a neo-Nazi reemergence of the Übermensch, which basically the occultic vision of the Übermensch was a new, more evolved race of human beings who were blonde and blue-eyed and who could live to be 200 and who had super strength and who had cosmic consciousness.
Absolutely.
This would be done through breeding, according to the Nazi idea, and that it was based on the Darwinian idea of evolution. But
Yes.
But in this case, it's more the vision of Harari and Ray Kurzweil, who wants to create a new human being, a new species that's superior based upon an amalgam of living bodies and computers.
Machines.
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean,
GNR, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. That's the new formula for the transhuman species that they see. So eugenics basically transferred into transhumanism. It's the root of it is eugenics, but they stopped with strictly biological means to attain this well-bred, superior Übermensch species. And they're using technologies, they think, to augment human capacity, but only for the few. It certainly won't apply to everybody. You can't have a bunch of Übermensches running around. You have to have the Untermensches on whom they step and control.
So basically, it's kind of this this sort of new man, this perfected species. I mean, Harari talks about, and as does Kurzweil, that they're going to create God by, that there is no God until they create one.
Right.
And that, it's, look, some of these technologies very well may be positive in the hands of the right people because they help cure diseases, which is their marketing entry in their.
That's their bait and switch routine. Yeah.
Yeah. But the point is that this is, no, I wanted to ask you, do you think, and maybe I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but do you think that CRISPR technologies and the mRNA therapy constitutes a nanoparticle type genetic altering of the DNA?
Well, I think the mRNA technology is definitely altering the DNA, but I don't know about the nanobot part. I don't know that there are nanoparticles in the vaccines as they exist. However, while that's probably not the case with the current vaccine batches that they have out right now, there is no question that nanoparticles could very well be part of any new vaccine regime, and that they could use nanoparticles to do any number of things, including attach to your neurons and likewise control your thought patterns vis-a-vis the cloud. Have you connected to the cloud and switching your brain into various states of being and behaviors. This would make all of us kind of like the victims in the movie Conspiracy Theory with Mel Brooks. I'm not Mel Brooks, Mel Gibson. So. Yeah,
I mean, and I've seen people I think maybe are already part of this.
It looks like some of these, as we were saying already, some of these people seem already to be under this algorithmic control.
And they're altering God's creation of man. I mean, it's really, we are created in the image of God. We are not created in the image of Kurzweil. This is
a vast usurpation. It's a total usurpation of the role of God in creation. Absolutely.
So, Michael, we're reaching toward the end. I like to try to think about something positive we can say. I mean, as I look at this situation, it's like it's none too pretty, as it were.
Right. Well, I have a plan at the end of the book. It's called The Grand Refusal for thwarting this regime, for thwarting this global agenda. I won't get into the points, but there is a 9-point plan of specific things, of refusing this, in the hands of these people, of refusing this technology, refusing the CBDC, refusing digital identity, divesting from ESGs, pulling your money out of ESG abiding banks. There's, we've gone through the whole panoply almost of all the technologies and mechanisms they're using. So there's countermeasures for all of those things.
Excellent. All right, Michael Rechtenwald, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your excellent book and other information about you.
Well, everything is available on my website at michaelrechtenwald.com, where you can buy books directly from me. You'll get signed copies, or, you can find all my essays and other writing on there for free. I don't charge like on Substack, and all the interviews. This one will be up there. Everything I do is on that site, michaelrechtenwald.com. And you can also get the book from Amazon and other booksellers, as you've mentioned, Barnes and Noble, etc.
Excellent. All right, Michael Rechtenwald, listen, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Let's talk again. I really appreciate you joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure, Charles.